In this video, we'll look closely at the grammar of the events run on the client, which is to say, on the device, as well as what can be done with them and how. Next, we'll talk about the composite command in detail. Lastly, we'll study the order of execution of the events. First of all, we'll review the invocations that can be made within a client event that we saw in the video about invocations of objects in smart devices. Invocations can be classified as server REST services as data providers or procedures that return data that will load in a variable on the device. They must be exposed as REST services. We can't call an internal procedure from the device if we're using an application with an online architecture. Later on, we'll talk about the offline case. Also, from a client-side event, we may want to add a new record to the database without prompting the user for information. This is done as in any other GeneXus object, using the methods and properties of the business component. The difference here is that it will also have to be exposed as a REST service, because we're calling from the device in an online architecture. From a client-side event, we can also call the Work With Details screen to perform insert, update, or delete operations. Internally, this will be translated into an invocation to the REST business component. Here, through the screen, the user is prompted for information. Next, this operation is performed in a transparent way for the developer. We may also just want to call the list or the detail in view mode. In addition, we may want to call panels for smart devices objects, which are a bit more flexible than work with screens. Or, we could also call a menu for smart devices, or use some of the features provided by APIs. This could include displaying a message on the screen, asking the user for confirmation to continue, returning to the indicated object or to the app's main object, adding a contact to the contact app of the device, and so on. A web panel can also be invoked. It'll be opened in the device browser, keeping the application and status bar of our app, as long as the browser is Chrome for Android and Safari for iOS. Otherwise, it'll be opened in the default browser, with the borders removed to make it look more similar to the rest of the application. That's all about invocations for now. As for commands, the accepted ones are shown here. We have the composite command, which we'll see in more detail. For example, a control can be shown or hidden, its class can be configured. The control structures if, do case, and do while can be used. For now, for-in structures are not included, nor the methods such as add of SDTs or business components. These structures accept Boolean expressions, which may include everything we know except for invocations. UDPs or external objects methods are not accepted. Invocations to subroutines can also be used, do sub, except in the menu for smart devices object. In the command for each selected line, only a procedure can be invoked. It's invoked once it's online. On the server, it's invoked n times, once for each selected line. And the result is returned as a REST service that's transparent for the developer. In assignments, a simple variable can be assigned an expression, or an invocation to a procedure that returns the value. But an SDT element or business component can only be assigned a value and not an expression. In addition, we have the return and refresh commands. Regarding the composite command that we had seen in several videos, this event is only used in customer-side events in smart devices when a couple of invocations or more must be made in an event, and in this case, it's mandatory to group the complete code of the event within this command. This command is important because if an error occurs in the call sequence, it stops running, and errors are automatically handled and displayed on the screen without any programming. We'll see this with an example. Suppose that we want to allow adding new speakers to the list of speakers of a session by inserting them into the database and then associating them with the session. So, when accessing the session speaker's screen, session speaker of work with device session, we add an add button to perform this operation. Here we see the event associated with the add button. We've enclosed its commands within the composite end composite block. Why? Because there's more than one command within the event. We may even add more commands within that same event. Note what we've programmed in this composite end composite block. First, we invoke the speaker's detail in insert mode, sending it as parameter a business component variable of speaker type, so that it returns the speaker's details that the user has just inserted in the detail when running from the invocation. Next, we call a procedure by sending it the ID of the session in which we're positioned and the ID of the speaker that has just been entered. It'll add that speaker to that session in the table corresponding to the session.speakers level. The procedure's output parameter will be a variable of messages predefined SDT data type. This is automatically returned by every business component when its method, getMessages, is used. Within the procedure, we'll load it with the error or warning messages that we want. In this way, this variable is automatically inspected when it returns. If there are any warnings, the corresponding messages are displayed, and the program continues running. If an error occurs, the message is also displayed, but the program stops running. This procedure will have to be exposed as a REST service because it's called from a client-side event. If no errors occurred, the following command is executed. The confirm method of the interop API shows the user the specified message and offers to continue running the following element by clicking on OK, or stopping there by clicking on Cancel. If you click on OK, the following invocation is performed, and the contact is added to the address book of the device. Once again, if this operation is successful, it continues to the next statement where, in this example, we leave the speaker name of the speaker business component empty and try to save. This will trigger an error, because if we open the speaker's transaction, we see that the error rule was programmed to not leave the speaker's name empty. Therefore, we'll see how the error message corresponding to the rule is displayed. In other words, we add this to force the business component error rule to be executed. The success message will not be shown because the execution was stopped there. This is an important difference with web apps because in them, when inside an event, an object called causes an error, the execution is not interrupted. It continues in the following statement, and the developer is responsible for handling the errors and programming the actions to take. On the other hand, the composite command is the one that stops the execution when an error occurs in a call sequence, and causes the errors to be automatically handled, displaying them on the screen without programming anything. We'll briefly talk about the execution order of the list and the detail when they're loaded for the first time, and then we'll see what happens when a client event is triggered when these objects are already open. The same will apply to smart device panels and to the list. And for those that have SD components, the same as for the detail will apply. If we're opening a list, they'll be executed in this order: the client start event on the client, and then the start, refresh, and load events on the server, if we're using an online architecture. If the object opened is the detail, they'll be executed in this order: the client start of the detail, followed by the start, refresh, and load events of the detail itself. Next, these same events will be executed for each section, starting from the general section. The same will happen if it's a panel with SD components. Once the screen has been loaded, regardless if it's the list or the detail, the user can start interacting. What happens when the user triggers an action? The associated code is executed on the client side, which is to say, on the device. If a call is found to a REST procedure, data provider, or business component, the call is made waiting for the result in order to continue running the rest of the code on the client. In other words, the REST service is invoked, and when the service responds with JSON data, what comes next is executed. Note that in any case, the system events start, refresh, load are not executed, unless a refresh command is found in the user events code. So what happens in this case with the refresh command? A trip to the server is made, and if the data hasn't been changed, nothing is brought to the client. Otherwise, the refresh and load events of every grid not based on an SDT are executed. This is the end of the topic.